In this episode of Undictated, we have a look at the role of business in standing up against government. David Ansara, the chief executive of the Free Market Foundation, says that business is being lily-livered and limp-wristed on NHI. And if you have a look at what happened at ArcelorMittal, it just shows what happens if you believe the stories that are coming out of Pretoria. We'll be looking at that in some detail in this episode of Undictated. Well, David, good to be talking with you again. It's a couple of months since we last chatted, so it's due. And the piece that sparked me into finally picking up the phone and saying, "Hey, let's have an update," was your attack on business on the way that it is approaching the National Health Insurance, or NHI. It's all about, I suppose, something that is. It seems to be in the fantasy land of politicians, but on the other hand, it is something that they've pushed through Parliament. So, what drew you to targeting this particular area when there are really so many other areas to look at?
Well, Alec, national health insurance is not a new policy proposal. This has been around essentially since about 2007 after the Polokwane conference. And so it's been bubbling away in the background, and it seems to go through periods where there's a lot of activity and action, and then it dies down and people's concerns are allayed. But now we find ourselves on the eve of one of the most critical elections, if not the most critical election since 1994. And the ANC is witnessing the decline of its popular support and is trying to drive through populist measures through Parliament. So that's why there's this renewed sense of urgency with the NHI bill. It was passed by the National Assembly. Now it's before the National Council of Provinces. I believe that vote is being delayed to next week. We're recording on Friday. But for all intents and purposes, it seems to be going through. And throughout this process, big business in particular and a variety of other civil society actors have been very patiently engaging with the government on this issue. And there were over 100 submissions to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee in the National Assembly, all of which made fairly substantive suggestions for amendment. None of those amendments were incorporated at all. So essentially, there were a few spelling errors that were corrected, but the original bill remains in its original form. So the way we see this is that this is being driven through Parliament, and business is essentially being ignored. And I think what is happening here is that business has taken a rather equivocal stance. It said, well, we see what you're doing here. We support your goals and ambitions. We also want to see universal healthcare in South Africa, and this is our social mandate is to support this bill. But please, pretty please, could you amend Section 33 of the bill, which would prohibit us as private medical healthcare providers from providing services that the NHI proposes to provide itself. And so what we interpret this as is really negotiating from a position of weakness rather than a position of strength. And it is very important to lobby and to engage in that discursive, deliberative process and to argue your interests. But business really hasn't been asserting itself forcefully enough.
Something that struck me in this context was in the past week, the chief rabbi of South Africa, Warren Goldstein, issued a very strong video statement where he called the president of the country, of the ANC, an anti-Semite. Now, if you consider how many Jewish business leaders there are who seem to be, as you're saying, as you put it, or perhaps other people have put it, appeasing whatever this supposedly anti-Semitic government is going ahead with, you'd think at some point in time there would be a bit of a wake-up call. Why is it that business is taking the line of least resistance?
Well, I think many businesses fear being frozen out of the discussion. So I had a conversation with a senior executive in the health space, and he was saying, well, I don't want to be too aggressive because at any point I can pick up the phone and speak to Nicholas Crisp, who's the Deputy Director General in the Department of Health and who's really the champion of NHI. And my question to this executive was, well, what is that access actually giving you? And if we go through just the recent history of the NHI bill, it doesn't seem like businesses such as the one that this executive led was really able to extract the concessions that they thought. So I think a lot of it is dressed up in sort of patriotic terms. Well, we're all in this together. The country is going through a crisis or multiple concurrent crises, and we as business need to galvanize behind the government and help to support the government in resolving some of these systemic problems. But I think what they're failing to do is to really truly recognize their bargaining power. The only reason anything works in South Africa is because of the private sector. The state is failing, as I indicated in my speech several months ago. The center cannot hold. Things are falling apart. But this is the wrong approach. The social compacting approach really reinforces the policy status quo. A lot of these problems that we see, whether it's the energy crisis, the breakdown of Eskom, the collapse of the transport infrastructure. I mean, you had quite a few discussions on your show recently about the ports backlogs and the failure of the ports. All of these problems are downstream from the policy decisions that the government has taken. So in our view, if you're going to engage in negotiations with the government, firstly, you need to recognize that you are a legitimate social actor as business. You have interests to defend. Those are the interests of your staff, your shareholders, your board, and your customers as well. And you must assert those interests. It doesn't mean that you have to be aggressive or nasty, but you must just understand where your interests lie and who you are serving. So we hear a lot of discussions around businesses' leadership role. I would say they need to recognize the gravity of that leadership role. And that sometimes means taking a position that is at odds with what the government is proposing. So by all means, lobby and engage, but recognize what your interests are and follow that approach rather than the social compacting approach.
I'm going to quote to you something that you said in your speech at the Rand Club 2 months ago. We are governed by our inferiors. All the power they have is the power we perceive them to have. It is not real. That's not something that has landed within the South African corporate business community.
Yeah, and I think we must also be very careful when we wade into these political waters as business. So, I think business often says, well, we're apolitical. We just care about the best outcomes. We serve the national interest rather than the political interest. But actually, I think that that's quite naive. I think many businesses that have joined these social compacts, the partnership initiative being the most recent iteration of this, are very much seen as part of a specific political faction of the ANC. And that is often thrown in their faces by organizations or people on the left to say, oh, look, there's just this collusion between big business and the state. So I would say business's approach should be one of asserting its independence. You can definitely engage in political contestation, but hitching yourself to a particular political faction or a particular personality or individual is very dangerous because political fortunes change. This is the inevitable cycle of politics. And now suddenly, to quote Warren Buffett, it's only when the tide goes out that you realize who's been swimming naked. And I think a lot of businesses might be caught with their pants down.
But they're going to swap sides again, as they always do, as they always have. They've got the lobbyists who will then talk to the new guys. But it is interesting, the point you make there about the political environment changing. It's almost like those who live in ivory towers, and it's not just the guys in Pretoria, but also those within corporations, are not reading what's happening on the ground, are not seeing, perhaps they're just not believing the polls. But there is a strong potential that within 6 months we'll have a very different government in South Africa. And at that point in time, perhaps things might be easier for business to go ahead. But I'd like to bring you back to a real life example with ArcelorMittal. I spoke with Cobus Verster this week, the chief executive, after he'd had to cut his business by 35%, laying off 2,000 people in my old hometown where I grew up of Newcastle, which will decimate that, well, worse than decimate the place. It is really going to be it's going to smash Newcastle without having ArcelorMittal as the major employer. Who knows what will happen there? There's another 1,500 people elsewhere. But he says they have been talking to government for 5 years on the issues that have now finally come to a head. My question here is, if they've been talking for 5 years and have got nowhere, other businesses would be doing the same thing. Where does it end? When does the penny finally drop? When you have to do the kind of action that ArcelorMittal has been forced into?
Yeah, look, those closures of those plants and the downsizing of ArcelorMittal's operations, that is very regrettable. But it is the consequence of South Africa's very difficult operating environment, which, again, I should stress, is caused by policy decisions taken by this government. So we also had a senior executive from Volkswagen saying, look, they've had a long history in South Africa, but the lack of energy availability and the fractious labor relations going to make it very difficult for him to argue the case to remain invested in this country. I think that should be a huge red flag. VW is the largest private sector employer in the Eastern Cape. I think it employs about 6,000 people. Getting back to ArcelorMittal, I mean, I remember in a previous role engaging with ArcelorMittal in the Vaal, and they told me an anecdote of they offered to pave the potholed roads in the outside of their facilities, and they needed to engage with the Mfuleni municipality, and they were offering to do this at their own cost. ArcelorMittal were doing so, and all they needed to do was kind of get permission from Mfuleni to make this happen. And none of the officials were interested. All of the meetings were cancelled because the officials didn't show up. So I would say, well, rather than waiting for permission, start solving these problems yourselves. Again, that gets back to this implicit subservience that I think characterizes a lot of engagement with government. Businesses see themselves as having to ask for permission, to plead with the government for help. But I would say the government's not coming to save you. No one's coming to save you. If you want to preserve your business and keep adding value and making money in South Africa, you need to solve some of these problems yourself. That doesn't mean doing it on your own, but reaching out to others. The lady from the Association of Chambers of Commerce, who you had on your show recently, whose name escapes me,
Melanie
I think
Vaness.
yes, that's a, I think she's been very bold in stating the extent of some of the governance failures and how that's impacting on business. And I think she used the word gatvol. But I think we need to translate that gatvulness into action, into actually now starting to solve some of these problems. Because if we continue on the current trajectory, we're going to be on a losing wicket.
Again, going back to a point that you made earlier, which really should be discussed at the top of the agenda in boardrooms nowadays, is state proofing your business. It's almost like there's this hope within many organizations that, well, until my share options finally vest in 5 years' time, perhaps the country will be able to kind of keep it together, rather than saying, what is an infinite business? What's going to happen to this business in 20 years' time if we get a continuation of the mismanagement that we have today? And just take that as a given, and then how do you state proof your business? That surely is something that I know you've been banging that drum. It has to be started to be listened to or heard now.
Yeah, and state proofing is also a mindset change of not seeing yourself as secondary to the government or some kind of other social actor. It's about preserving value, recognizing that a lot of the legislative developments that are coming out of our parliament are fundamentally hostile to free enterprise and big business. So I think big business is maybe suffering from a high time preference. They want to solve some of the immediate problems now, and they see that as the best way of doing that as collaborating and trying to help the government. But I think we should have a low time preference. We should be thinking about the future of business in South Africa, not just next year or next quarter, but for the next 10, 20 years. Because if people want to live in this country and to prosper, they need to basically carve out that independence that we were speaking about earlier. And that requires sometimes standing up to the state and resisting hostile policy, not just trying to minimize the impact.
So, David, a more controversial question. As you said earlier, businesses like to be positioning themselves as apolitical, which is a lot of nonsense, actually, because they are behind the scenes working on government contracts, putting government affiliated people on boards. We just have a look at how many of the ANC cadres are chairwomen of major corporations in South Africa. So, but it's a facade that they like to put forward. The opposition parties are telling us that we've got one last chance for this democracy in the next election, which is about 6 months away, we believe. Should business be getting involved in that at the very least, if they don't want to promote free enterprise driven political parties, at the very least, trying to get people involved and to sign up and register?
Yeah, so the democratic contestation, the party political arena, I think is very important, and I believe it's quite a positive development that we're now seeing increased competition in the political space, a lot more parties on the scene. I don't think a lot of those parties are clearly differentiating themselves enough from the ANC. So there are multiple parties at the moment, but which are the parties that are outright rejecting BEE? Maybe the Freedom Front Plus. But so I think that many of these parties are still swimming in the ideological slipstream of the ANC. But I am quite encouraged to see that there's going to be more pluralism in the future, and I think coalition politics is going to be a permanent feature of South African political life for the indefinite future. However, I would say that if you look, for example, at the situation in Tshwane, I think that's a very illustrative microcosm for what South Africa might look like post 2024. That you have, a loose coalition of quite divergent interests, deployed cadres within the civil service who are actively trying to undermine the new coalition administration. When Celia Brink, the mayor, stood up against the public sector unions, we then saw strikes and mounds of rubbish piling on people's pavements. And then some of the coalition partners started to get a little bit restless and concerned that their constituents were going to abandon them or put pressure on them. And so, these coalitions can be a little bit unstable as a result. So I would certainly encourage people to vote, particularly for parties that encourage freedom, individual freedom, non-racialism, a market economy. Those are the values that we as the Free Market Foundation espouse. And so we would like to see parties that share those values doing well. We are a non-partisan organization, so we don't support any particular political party. But I would also say, getting back to this idea of state proofing, even the best, most capable politicians, if they were to come in tomorrow, would struggle to turn around some of these failed municipalities and government departments. We need I think, a radical restructuring of South Africa's political institutions. Our cabinet is extremely bloated. We have vast amounts of state intervention in South Africa's economy. So the Free Market Foundation, we are busy with a privatization in practice paper in which we look at some of the key state-owned assets and how those could be meaningfully privatized. I think that is a very urgent necessity in South Africa, that we need to minimize the state power in South Africa. So changing the sailor of the ship, or the captain of the ship at this stage, I think would be welcomed. But the ship is still taking on water and is in danger of sinking. But the ship, I mean by the government, not the country. I think South Africa will survive, but I'm not sure if the state will survive in its current manifestation.
David Ansara is the Chief Executive of the Free Market Foundation. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.